Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls series has a lot of interesting intelligent races, and even though we can only play as a handful of them in the games, we can still learn about tons more in the lore. Now, one of the most interesting obscure races in the Elder Scrolls universe are the now extinct Kothringi humans, silver-skinned tribal humans that dwelt in the swamps of Blackmarsh. Truth be told, they are so curious that they are among my favorite peoples in the Elder Scrolls universe, and therefore we'll cover all of their lore today in this video, after the intro. So, the Kothringi, a metallic silver-skinned race of humans that live in Blackmarsh, primarily close to the swamp rivers and coasts of Blackmarsh. Their presence in Blackmarsh has never really been dated, but in some of the very earliest records about Blackmarsh in the early Meretic era, they were already reported to be there, and were among those races enslaved by the Ayleid elves, alongside the Khajiit and Argonians and other beast races, after the Ayleid arrival in the Heartland during the Meretic era. To those who came into contact with the Kothringi, they were known as the Lustrous or Shining Folk, and something about them made them more resistant to magic, specifically some Ayleid magic, which may have something to do with their previous enslavement, but we don't know too many details about that. Now, despite being there in the earliest known times, the Kothringi civilization, other than near the very end of their history, never really developed further than a tribal and primitive culture, just like most other swamp cultures in the Blackmarsh. Just like the Argonians and some of the other weird human races in Blackmarsh that we'll touch on a bit later in this video. Now, their tribal way of life made it so that in terms of historical relevancy they are often overshadowed by the other races who would make empires and rule large swaths of land. Meanwhile, the Kothringi would continue to live in small villages in primitive stone huts with thatched roofs, in small contained tribes that mostly seem to live off fish, swamp creatures like snails, and basic swamp-based agriculture. Their tribes were traditionally headed by a chieftain with two important advisors, a tribe shaman to aid the chief in religious matters and a war chief to aid the chieftain in matters of war and train their warriors. The Kothringi were said to be fierce in battle, using throwing knives, axes and many other weapons, and by some of the Argonians they were feared more than other humans, as the Kothringi were among the very few who could move silently through a swamp while wearing battle gear. Now, interestingly enough, while the Kothringi wore distinctive primitive armor and mage robes into battle and into the hunt, their society on Tamriel was famous for having a distaste for clothing, which may have something to do with their metallic skin, but we don't have an adequate explanation for it. As in all sources that we have about their culture, even the more recent ones, and some of the descriptions that the people on Tamriel themselves give about the Kothringi are described as a people who prefer to go naked in their daily lives, in peacetime at least, with only jewelry like gems on a strand or polished glass beads on a strand, adorning their bodies in their day-to-day lives in their villages. Now, the footage that you see, which is footage from the Elder Scrolls Online where we can observe what was basically the last remnant of their civilization, we see a village which is both in civil conflict and has recently been attacked, which is basically the explanation as to why they are not all just naked and all wearing some form of battle gear, light armor, or at least hunting clothes. And in the lore, the clothes that they do wear when they wear them, they are known to be exceptional, as the Kothringi are known to be excellent enchanters of armor and robes, enchanting the clothing that they have for battle with enchantments that heightens the senses and reflexes of the wearer. These clothings and their enchantments have been described as unique to their people and very strange and complex to decipher by scholars and other enchanters. Although in their daily lives, like I said, they prefer to go on without them and live without clothing other than during wartime or when traveling to other civilizations, presumably to not stand out too much in a crowd, for example, when traveling somewhere else. Now, that having been said, strange and complex enchanted and clothing wasn't the only thing that they could make. In their day, the Kothringi were renowned craftsmen, and they were known to be very skilled leather workers, for example, being able to work the skins of swamp dragons, or wamasus as they're called, and hashmotas. Both are very fearsome creatures, and the Kothringi were known to be able to work their skins into high quality leathers after taking them down in the hunt. While they didn't seem to have been miners, the Kothringi did trade with other races for metals and gemstones, which they were able to smith into really solid weapons, into their own coins, musical instruments and jewelry to wear on their bodies, with them preferring faceted gemstones as they reminded them of shiny fish scales. And having mentioned fish, they were also renowned fishers and sailors, with especially their seafaring techniques being quite interesting, as they were able to make really strong nautical ropes which had metal woven into the rope strands, and they had a very strange and unique shipbuilding tradition, as they were able to make sailed canoes with very shallow drafts that somehow were still stable while sailing, and they were able to navigate both the swamps of Blackmarsh with them and the coastal regions of Tamriel, as by using the vessels that they built, we know that they made contact with other, bigger civilizations, from Valenwood to elsewhere, and as such they had quite some contact with other civilizations, despite them never really having any form of empire or true realm of their own, other than their tribal villages. Now, those cultures that remember the Kothringi describe them as a quite merry people, honest and forthright. But the thing that people remember most about them after their extinction is their love for music, which is said to have really been central to their culture. According to befriended Argonian tribes, the Kothringi sang a lot, and music was often featured during daily activities and celebrations, and while they were primitive, they had a whole array of their own instruments, from blow instruments fashioned from monster horns, to gigantic drums made out of hollow logs and harps made out of cliffstrider sinews. And on top of that, they really love to use all kinds of chimes, with both large and small metallic chimes featuring heavily in records about their civilization, as they often even had strings filled with chimes around their bodies to make music with. They were known for merry musical celebrations, and while they sometimes warred with the Argonians, some Kothringi tribes were actually known to also befriend local Argonian tribes and even feast with them and make music for them, with some Argonians who remember them from before their extinction remembering a time when the people of Silver Skin and the people of the Root walked hand in hand. But this was probably on a tribe-to-tribe basis, so some tribes you were friends with, the others you were enemies with, as both the Kothringi and Argonians at this time were tribal and they didn't have some sort of central government uniting all of the tribes. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Kothringi is their religion, which you can see in the many religious totems dotting their villages. You see, according to Tamrielic scholars, the earliest records of Kothringi have them worshipping the Daedra. Specifically, we know of them worshipping Clavicus Vile, the Daedra Prince of Bargains. However, as time went on, more and more Kothringi tribes abandoned these so-called old ways and came to worship a pantheon mostly composed of Aedra. Now, while we don't have a full Kothringi pantheon, we do know that they worship the god Zen, the god of agriculture, fairness and fair exchange. This god is the chief of their pantheon, and it's said that they picked the worship of Zen up from a mixture of Argonian tribes who acknowledge Zen as a deity, who in turn picked it up from the Ekaviri, which is allegedly how Zen worship found its way to Kothringi society, who then exported their beliefs to Valenwood in their trade with the Bosmer, who then took Zen into their pantheon, where he became the god of vengeance. Which is an interesting turn of events, from alleged Ekaviri deity to apparently a deity to some Argonian tribes, to the chief of the Kothringi pantheon, to then making it to the Bosmer pantheon. Interesting stuff. Now, what we do know is that Zen is primarily worshipped as the god of agriculture by the Kothringi, with his symbol in their culture being a spade, and religious artifacts from Kothringi history also taking the shape of holy spades, which they used to break agricultural ground with apparently some religious ceremony. Now, other than that, we know that they worship the Bella with particular fondness, with one out-of-game text written by an ex-developer stating that they worship the Bella as Dibe, who was apparently part of a trio called the Mothers of the All Around Us, formed by Mara, Dibe and Kin, some aspect of Kinneret or Kine, but that's out-of-game text, so take it with a grain of salt. That being said, as part of their religious customs, they were known to bury their dead with small religious offerings like glass beads and gems, but we don't know what god that this was associated with or who they associated with death. In fact, other than what I've told you so far, there straight up is very little that we know of their religion, as most of the Kothringi came to a painful end during a societal collapse in the middle of the Second Era, which obviously makes it a little bit harder to research their culture, especially since they were tribal people and probably didn't record much. Now, to understand why they all disappeared, we need to go into some history. You see, when the Reman Empire, which is the second Cyrodiilic Empire at the end of the First Era, took over parts of Blackmarsh, it led to an apparent rapid development of Kothringi culture. The Kothringi were trusted by the Imperial legions of the Empire to help with the administration of the province, at least apparently trusted a little more than the Argonians, as they were put into some government positions. This led to some Kothringi fighting in the army, some taking government positions, and many coming together to form larger settlements and cities within the Imperial territory in Blackmarsh, like the city of Gideon, for example, which after the Aeolid period was apparently taken over and rebuilt by the Kothringi during the Reman Empire days. During this time, a Kothringi warrior named Zook was even a bodyguard of the wife of the last emperor of the Reman dynasty, Reman III, and we can find the village that he founded after Reman's assassination in the Elder Scrolls Online, which is pretty cool stuff, as he went back home after Reman got assassinated and there founded a new village, which became the village of Zook. They were really going places at this time, developing as a society, becoming more cosmopolitan, that is, until their society collapsed in a matter of years, with one of Tamriel's worst epidemics, the Knaten flu, a disease that ravaged Second Era Tamriel, throwing many places in disarray and nearly destroying several of the big civilizations, like the Khajiit civilization, which was hit particularly hard. Now, the Knaten flu hit the hardest in Blackmarsh, spreading through the swamps like wildfire and infecting all non-Argonians, and quite literally ridding Blackmarsh of all non-Argonian cultures, bringing an end to the tribal fox beast race, the Lilmothid, which lived on the southern coast, the blind Orma humans of Blackmarsh, the strange Horwali and Yespet humans, and the Kothringi humans. Their society, along with all those other cultures, was completely wiped out in Blackmarsh by this disease, with coincidentally many blaming the Argonians for the disease, as many theorize that the swamp-dwelling Argonians who had never liked others in their swamps released the disease, so released the Knaten flu to get rid of all the others. Although those tribes who were friends with the Kothringi tribe state that no Argonian would ever destroy something so merry and beautiful, referring to the music culture of the Kothringi. Now, we don't know the truth behind the origin of the disease, but what we do know is that within a short period, the Kothringi went from being an alive and quickly developing culture to a very interesting yet dead historical curiosity. In fact, their last years are quite tragic, as during their full societal collapse, some uninfected actually fled Blackmarsh in a ship to find refuge somewhere else and settle somewhere else, where the Knaten flu hadn't come to yet, but they were turned down from every port, from elsewhere to Hammerfell. They sailed, but nowhere they were allowed to make port for fear of them carrying the disease with them. And eventually they would die out at sea in the Abyssinian Sea, as their supplies probably ran out, and the people of Hammerfell, at least a few years later, would start to observe the so-called Day of Shame, where they remember the ship filled with Kothringi refugees that they abandoned in their time of need. And if that wasn't bad enough, around this time some were apparently also captured by Molag Bal and put to slavery in his Daedric plain of Cold Harbor, bringing an end to Kothringi society, as the remaining small villages and Kothringi population in the cities would eventually die out to the Knaten flu, which would come to ravage all of Tamriel for several more years after the initial outbreak in Blackmarsh. Now, in the Elder Scrolls Online we can meet a few remnants of the Kothringi society. The first is a small village of Stillrise, where the local Kothringi tribe went into a treacherous bargain with the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile. Their ancient patron of the old ways, they begged for protection against the Knaten flu, and Clavicus Vile then turned them into cursed undead as part of the bargain. I cover that quest in more detail in its own dedicated video, which is in the description. And the second remnant that we can find has become immune to the flu and immortal due to having contact with ancient Aeolid magic, and I'll cover that case in a future video most likely. Now, that having been said, among humans the Kothringi were quite unique. While the playable human races are mostly based on real-life humans, who in the predominant theories about early humanity in the Elder Scrolls universe find their origin in continents outside of Tamriel, with the now frozen Atmora being the origin point for the Nords, Imperials and Bretons, who evolved from the Nedic humans, and the sunken continent of Yokuda being the ancestral homeland of the Redguards. Now, in those theories where the playable races come from outside of Tamriel, the Kothringi, along with some other weird tribes of humans that I mentioned earlier in the video, such as the eyeless Orma humans, the mysterious Horwali and the mysterious Yespet humans, who all also find their origin in Blackmarsh, the Kothringi and those other races are actually Tamrielic natives in that theory, just like the Khajiit and Argonians and Lilmothid, which is extremely interesting, as if those theories are right, all of the native human races are all evolved to be significantly different from the human races from outside Tamriel, who are all playable. With the Kothringi having silver skin and the Orma humans being born without eyes, keeping with the trend that Tamrielic native races are weirder and more alien than the races inspired by our world, such as for example the Argonians and the Khajiit are also native. Although all of that's just a theory, as there are other unreliable sources that dispute some of it, but I feel quite confident in this whole theory. But do take it with the appropriate amount of salt, as some theories rather have them be a split off from another native Nedic population on Tamriel. But I explain all of that and that whole theory in several other videos, and it would be a little bit off topic to go into a deranged discussion about it here. So I'll also put my Atmora video in the description in case you want to hear the argument in full. And that is about all I can say about the Kothringi, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the video and managed to learn something new about the Elder Scrolls universe today. And if you did, why not give the video a like or a hype? It would really help me out. Now, observant viewers will have noticed that I talked about the Kothringi once before in the earlier years of the channel, and I put that older video also in a recent lore collection. But in the years since, we've discovered so much more about them that a video was needed, because the other one was severely outdated and it was screaming for a remaster. Plus, the Kothringi is one of my favorite cultures on Tamriel, gives me an excuse to talk about them again, and it's my channel, so shut up, I can do what I want. And now it's time for me to vocally thank my top Patreon subscribers: Goblark, Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, King Chris 20, Volkjor of Argonia, RB Dash, Lexicon, Providence, Polycom, Sir Otter, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Spaceman, James Lynch and Bara Dermas. It's thanks to these people and all the other lovely people on screen that this channel stays alive, as they are my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members. And thanks to them I can continue making these videos, so huge thanks to them. There's links in the description in case you want to join them on screen. See you next video.